Okay, this is for Algebra 1A, the review of Chapter 3. Remember, you can always review in your journals, or you can go to page 164 through page 166, and we are doing every section in Chapter 3 except for the last two. We just didn't have time to cover those before we take the test. The first question, I didn't really write it out, but it just says determine whether the relation is a function. If the relation is a function, determine whether the relation is linear or nonlinear. So remember, for it to be a function, each input can only have one output. Each x can only have one y. If one x has two different y's, it's not a function. So in this case, every x is only going to one number. So yeah, it is a function. But the other part of the question is it linear or not? Is it a linear equation? And the reason you know it's not linear, see, as x is increasing by the same amount each time, it's plus 1, plus 1, plus 1. The y is not decreasing by the same amount. It's decreasing by 1, but then it's adding 4, and then it's adding 5. There's not a constant rate of change. And since it's not a constant rate of change, it's not linear. It looks very interesting if you graph this. So it's nonlinear. But how do you answer that same question if it's like in this format? Y equals negative 2x plus 3. Same question, is it a function and is it linear? Well, actually, it helps to, if it's linear, it usually is a function. There's a couple exceptions to that. And so how do we know if this is linear? Anything that's in the form of y equals mx plus b is linear. The y is the y, the equal is the equal. A number in front of the x is the m. It can't be a that will work for now. And then the x is an x, and then the number at the end is the b. So this is linear, and it's also a function, because all linears are functions unless it's something like this, a straight line down. Then it doesn't pass the vertical line test on a graph, and then it wouldn't be a function. Okay, so looking at number 3, is this linear as a function? Well, x equals negative 7. If you were to graph that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it would be linear, but it wouldn't pass the vertical line test. So it's actually not a function. In other words, each input for negative 7 has multiple outputs for the y. It's a 1 for the y, it's a 2, it's a 3. In fact, it's every number for y. So it's not a function. That would be a case where that can happen. All right, for number 4, it says find domain in range, and then is it discrete or continuous? So the domain is all the x values. Now, see how these arrows are pointing on? If you were to extend those arrows, it would forever go on. So the x values are all real numbers. But looking at the y values, it doesn't go up and down forever, now does it? It starts at the origin, and it goes up. So it's y would be, y is greater than, and it looks like it's hitting the 0, so it's greater than or equal to 0. Okay, and is it discrete or continuous? Well, the line is continuous. And then on this one here, is it discrete, or I'm sorry, what's the domain and range? The domain is the x value, so it's negative 2, it'd be a positive 2, and, I'm sorry, a positive 1 and a positive 2. Change that to a 1 and a 2. That's the domain. Whoops, the brackets should look like this. What's the range? The range should be all the y values, so it looks like it's going up 2. This is also going up 2, so I don't need to write it twice. And this one's going down 2. And is it discrete or continuous? Well, they're just dots, so it's discrete. Okay. So we need to, these are two type of questions a little worried about on the test. So I want to go over those real quick. Evaluate the function for negative 1, 0, and 3. It means you need to substitute all of these into this equation in place of the x. So g of negative 1. equals negative 3 times x would be a negative 1. We're putting this negative 1 in place of the x plus 4. So it would be g of negative 1 equals 3 plus 4, because a negative times a negative is a positive. So if you input a negative 1, your output would be a 7. So the answer to that would be, you can leave it like this, but just cleaner to write a negative 1 is your input and 7 is your output, and put them in parentheses. Okay, you tried a negative 1, now we need to substitute in a 0. So it's like g of 0 equals a negative 3 times 0 plus 4. So a negative 3 times 0 is just 0. You don't have to even write it. So g of 0 would equal 4. So if you input a 0, your output is a 4. And then the last time you want to try a 3. So g of 3 equals negative 3 times 3 plus 4. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 plus 4 is 13. So g of 3 equals 13. So if you input a 3, your output would be a 13. And then you might get ones like this where there's an exponent. It's pretty easy. You just do the normal rules of operation here. So let's try negative 1 first. F of negative 1 equals 3 times negative 1 squared minus 5. You see how I just put a negative 1 in place of the x, because it says to put a negative 1 in. And that would be f of negative 1 equals a negative 1 squared is just a positive 1. So it would be 3 times 1, and 3 times 1 is 3. So if I input a negative 1, my output would be a 3. Now we try the next number, 0. Anything to the 0 power equals 1. So if I input a 0, you'd have 3, 0, squared. I'm sorry, I told you the wrong thing. 0 squared is just 0 times 0, which is 0. And 3 times 0 would be 0. And 0 take away 5 would just be negative 5. If I input a 0, my output is a negative 5. And then you would try the last number, which is a 3. Let's just do it real quick. F of 3 equals 3 times 3. We're putting a 3 in place of the x, so it's a 3 squared minus 5. 3 squared is 9. F of 3 equals 3 times 9 minus 5. 3 times 9 is 27. 27 minus 5 is 22. If I input a 3, my output would be 22. Okay, the last portion of this is to identify the slope, the y-intercept, and the x-intercept. The slope is easy to find if it's in the format of y equals mx plus b. Whatever, and this one is the first one. Whatever's in front of the x is your slope. In this case, there's an invisible 1 in front of the x, so your slope is 1. And your b is just that last number. Your y-intercept is your b, and that's just a 5. What's your x-intercept? The x-intercept is if the y is 0. So if the y were 0, just substitute a 0 for the y. Subtract 5 from both sides. Negative 5 equals x. So the y-intercept would be x equals negative 5. Okay, what about number 9? Identify the slope. Well, remember I said if it's in this format, it's easy to find the slope. It's not in that format. In fact, there's not even a y. So there is no slope on that one. That's like just done. So we don't have to worry about that one. But what about the y-intercept? Well, if the x was 0, it'd be 0 equals 5. That's not even possible, right? So, that's not one we have to worry about either. And then let's look at this last question here. Actually, I'm looking at the time. We need to stop. So please watch this video more than once if you need to, and hopefully this helps you guys get ready for your final.
When's A-Bar's final?